Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Open Democracy's live weekly discussion. This time round, we have a fascinating panel and discussion on Libya. I'm Mary Fitzgerald. I'm the editor-in-chief of Open Democracy. I think you probably all know quite a lot about Open Democracy, but we are a global media platform. We exist to challenge power, inspire change. We're running weekly dispatches on the unfolding COVID-19 crisis and its impact for democracy and human rights across the world. Thank you so much for joining, and we just want to encourage all of you to get involved in the conversation. Thank you to all who submitted questions and comments ahead of time. We're going to address them, as many of them as we can. If you're joining on Zoom, if you have a question or comment for us, click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. You can type into the chat window. If you're joining from YouTube, you can add your input and it'll be fed back to the panelists. If you're not already signed up to our weekly newsletter, you can do so. opendemocracy.net/newsletter, and Adam will put that in the chat so you can stay informed about all the events we're running and the stories we publish. It's quite important to add the disclaimer that I do every week, which is these are conversations happening in lockdown. There may be unscheduled interruptions from pets, small children, other unexpected visitors. We apologize in advance if that happens. I'm broadcasting from the floor of my son's bedroom at the moment. So apologies in advance for that, but we hope this is still going to be a stimulating and thought-provoking discussion. I'm going to hand over to our chair now. Marwa Mohammed is Head of Advocacy and Outreach at Lawyers for Justice in Libya. Prior to joining Lawyers for Justice, she worked as a Libya researcher at Amnesty, documenting human rights violations in Libya. And I will hand over to her now to introduce the rest of our panel. Thanks so much again.
Great, thank you, Mary. And thank you, Open Democracy. We are really excited about this web series and the op-eds that we have that have been published over the past few weeks, and now concluding that with this webinar. And so I'll take the opportunity to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have Asma Khalifa, who is a Libyan activist and researcher and co-founder of the Tamazight women's movement. She's currently a research fellow at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies. In 2017, Asma was named one of the 100 most influential young Africans. Next, we have Tarek Megerisi. He's a Libyan political analyst and researcher, currently a policy fellow of the North Africa and Middle East program at the European Council of Foreign Relations in London. We also have Hanan Salah with us today on the panel. She's a senior Libya researcher in the Middle East and North Africa division at Human Rights Watch. And finally, last but not least, we have Kate Vigner-Warren, sorry, Kate. She's a senior legal advisor for the MENA program of the International Commission of Jurists. Prior to joining the ICJ, she was a consultant with the UN DOC's Eastern Africa and Southeast Asia Regional Office. She's a legal director of Fortified Rights in Southeast Asia and a prosecution lawyer at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your contributions to the op-eds. I hope that everyone in the audience has had an opportunity to read the op-eds that we have been publishing on the Open Democracy platform over the past few weeks. So we'll start our discussions by allowing the panelists the opportunity to give us a bit more detail and a bit more context to the op-eds that they had written. And so I'm going to start with Tarek. We launched our web series of op-eds with your piece, looking at how COVID-19 has acted almost as a nuisance, getting in the way of the conflict in Libya. And as you eloquently put it, and I quote, "While the rest of the world sacrifices their economies on the altar of public health, Libya has simply told COVID-19 to wait its turn." And this is very much the case. So I ask you, Tarek, to elaborate perhaps on that piece, and if you could just tell us generally how, if we can, if at all, can we attribute the role of the pandemic in the developments of the conflict over the past few months? And if you can also highlight if that has played any role in the current developments that we've seen over the past few days in Libya. Thank you, Tarek. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Marwa, for inviting me and for opening with this question. You know, I don't really think that we can attribute COVID-19 or the corona crisis, as it were, to any of the military developments that have been ongoing in Libya over the last month. And I know that might seem kind of bizarre to those who are tuning in from all over the world, who, you know, have seen such upheaval in their lives and seemingly on a global scale because of this. But, you know, for those in Western Libya, especially, the war itself is just so pervasive and all-consuming that COVID never really figured into it in any major way. And, you know, you could categorize the war, or at least the attacking general Khalifa Haftar, as jealous in a sense as well. So, you know, even when the crisis first began and, you know, the news was seized by it, the government in Tripoli were declaring curfews and allocating special budgets. This was the same exact period when a shelling campaign began on the capital by the attacking force and that General Haftar, which was the most destructive that we've seen yet in this year-long war. And it's a campaign that specifically targeted hospitals and medical facilities, you know, alongside the usual indiscriminate waves of shells over residential neighborhoods. So the more recent developments over the past week or so have been more about that, and, you know, an attempt to push those forces back and protect the civilians of Tripoli from more, you know, traditional man-made threats rather than viral ones. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Tarek. I'm sure there will be more questions around that as we proceed. But next, I'm going to move on to Hanan, where her piece shifts our focus from the more general context of the conflict and COVID into more how this conflict and the pandemic has impacted the lives of the civilian population. And whether and how this affects the human rights, and how does this affect the human rights situation in the country and the protection of civilians during this time. And one of the things that was highlighted in your piece, Hanan, is that you say that after years of political division, there's been neglect and armed conflict. Libya's health structure were already decimated long before the coronavirus outbreak. Yet, despite the pandemic, you further elaborated, there has been very little measures taken to address the civilian population and take measures to protect them. So in light of this, Hanan, could you please maybe elaborate a bit further on how the pandemic has actually shed light on the failure to protect the civilian population in the context of the conflict, and how has that played out in terms of the ongoing violations in humanitarian law, and what does this mean for accountability?
Okay, thank you so much for having me to openDemocracy, and also to you, Marwa, for chairing this really great panel. Really, in short, the war has had a devastating effect on civilians to date. While several areas in Libya, particularly obviously in Western Libya, have been affected because of the fighting, there's been, because of the fighting or because of shelling airstrikes and because of road closures, for example, that include towns in Western Libya, on the Western Libyan coast, or places more in the center of Libya, Beni Walid, Tarhuna, etc. It's really been Tripoli that has been on the receiving end of this conflict, and that has really faced major shelling airstrikes that have been, I can only describe as unhinged. And that, I was there the last time a few months ago, but I understand that now it's even become worse. According to the United Nations, there's currently over 200,000 people that are internally displaced because of this conflict. That's around 10% of the population of Tripoli. That's, quite a major number by itself to handle. So how do you imagine that it's even possible to put mechanisms in place to counter a pandemic such as the corona crisis that has really wrecked the systems in so many very advanced places when you have an ongoing armed conflict? I believe that this war has in fact left the vulnerable communities in Libya, and particularly obviously in Western Libya where this is playing out, totally exposed. And these include internally displaced people who often live in shelters, but also live in private housing, but also live in mixed shelters, migrants and asylum seekers, and people in detention. Those include migrants and asylum seekers, but also other detainee. Libya has quite a large detainee population. With regards to how this is all, with regards to the preparedness of Libya, the infrastructure in Libya is already poor and has been eroding for the past 10 years or so. And Libya is considered one of the countries that is at high risk of the corona crisis. It has not happened yet. There has not been a massive outbreak, but should it happen, which is the expectation because it's happening everywhere, then the capacity of the government in Eastern Libya or the authority in Western Libya is very weak when it comes to detecting and responding to this crisis. And the hospitals could very soon be overwhelmed by a large number of patients, which means that, the national health system, which is already decimated and long before this crisis started, is at a risk of a total collapse. And what do you do then? The pandemic is not going to end just because of the war. That unfortunately has not happened. What we have seen, and I would like to speak briefly about the two main sides to this conflict, very briefly, is that the operation that has been led by the Libyan Arab Armed Forces or the Libyan National Army, whatever you want to call the Haftar forces or Haftar groups, plus the affiliated armed groups, plus all the foreign backers, has been unhinged, and it has resulted in the killing of hundreds of civilians and the wounding and the maiming of also hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians. It also has the effect that critical civilian infrastructure, particularly health structures that are really necessary during a pandemic, and water networks, for example, have been destroyed. We have documented the broad use of explosive weapons in populated areas, both through airstrikes, drone strikes, but also through shelling, which is prohibited under international law and can be a war crime if there is a criminal intent. We have also documented the use of prohibited weapons, such as cluster bombs, by the LNA or by groups affiliated with the Libyan National Army. And that is a very serious issue and is of great concern. On the other side, we have seen that the GNA, or the Government of National Accord, which is the Tripoli Authority, has totally failed to ensure that civilians are not adjacent to military facilities, which of course heightens the risk of civilian harm. We have seen that migrants remain in detention facilities that are within the compounds of armed groups that are participating in the conflict. And we have seen that, we have seen the movement and the placement really of armed groups within civilian areas. This is massively reckless. There's no other way to describe that, and can obviously amount to a violation. I want to just say a word on accountability before handing it back to you, in that the domestic justice system has collapsed at a national level. The International Criminal Court, which has a mandate in Libya, has been very slow to conduct investigations and has not had the much desired deterrent effect to slow down the pace, at least, of war crimes. Not to say that they would stop them. While I would not put all my cards on it, but I do have some hope that member states of the Human Rights Council in Geneva in June finally pass a resolution to establish a commission of inquiry, to at least conduct investigations, to preserve evidence, and also where possible attribute responsibilities. I think that the world has failed Libyans many times over. Let's at least try to make sure that there's a robust body of documented evidence of crimes that can be used when there's finally an option to prosecute the probably many war criminals that this war will produce. Thanks for that.
Great, thank you, Hanan. Thank you for that quick summary of the realities on the ground and how, in fact, while there is a lot of documentation and we have been witnessing the escalation, we do still need an independent body that can investigate and identify the perpetrators, but like you rightfully said, in terms of also being able to preserve the evidence for future prosecution. So now I move on to Kate, whose piece zoomed in with a bit more specifics, looking particularly at detainees and the rights and their rights in detention, and including the right to health. What was particularly striking for me, Kate, in your piece was that the need to not only address the health concerns of those detainees, but how this pandemic takes a cold, hard look at the large numbers of those in detention. It does highlight the numbers that are held in arbitrary detention, and how this then raises the question of how to protect these individuals in light of a pandemic. But you also mentioned the need for, in terms of responsibility and who is responsible, and how states and equally non-state actors may be responsible for the protection of those being held, and what their obligations are in terms of international legal requirements. So maybe you could provide us with a bit more information or elaborate on the role of non-state actors and how.
Sure, thanks Marwa, and thanks also to Libyan Lawyers for Justice in Libya and openDemocracy for asking me to participate in this symposium and very important webinar. I think this question raises a really important issue that has particular resonance in Libya. I mean, as you said, my general point was that this obligation to protect and fulfill the rights to health and life are not just one that, it's not just one that's imposed on the GNA, it's also imposed on other non-state actors who have control over territory and control over the population there. And this is particularly important, I think, in the context of detention, given a lot of the detainees, thousands of detainees, are being held by non-state actors. They're not necessarily being held by the GNA or GNA-controlled forces. So I'm going to sort of turn and talk about international law in more detail and in sort of its technical terms to explain how I got to the point that these rights that detainees have should be protected by both state and non-state actors. So sort of generally, international human rights law imposes obligations on state actors, and that's to protect, to respect, protect and promote human rights and prevent violations and abuses of them through sort of legislative and other measures. Now, with the exception of non-state actors who operate with the support as an agent of state actors, non-state actors just generally have an obligation to respect the rights and the measures that have been taken by those state actors to protect them. Now, that obligation on states, however, is very much limited by the extent of their territorial control. If they don't exercise territorial control, then they are required to exercise due diligence to undertake reasonable measures to protect rights. And this is obviously particularly important, important issue in Libya, where the internationally recognised government, the GNA, only controls a portion of the territory. This could create a vacuum which leaves significant portions of the population vulnerable in the context of this pandemic, because the state has actually limited power to ensure measures can be undertaken to protect them. There is increasing recognition, though, that this vacuum can be filled where non-state actors exercise some degree of control over a given territory and over the population. And this is particularly the case in the context of conflicts. So according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, in such cases, non-state actors can assume, whether it's voluntarily or not, obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights in a way that's similar to state actor obligations. And there's no time to go through all the sources which support that, that principle, but it's increasingly being considered to be the case in sort of Security Council resolutions, statements by UN special rapporteurs, and in practice by non-state actors themselves. To determine the extent of control over territory and population requires quite a detailed and complicated examination of the legitimacy of those actors, the extent of their control, the exercise of their government functions. And we don't have time to go into that today, obviously for all of the non-state actors that are operating in Libya. But at least for the sort of east-west divide, where you have the absence of GNA control over the large parts of the eastern portions of the west, and the LAAF's relatively long-standing control with House of Reps backing indicates that they would have such a heightened obligation. So that's the sort of first point. And turning to the second part of that question and what that really means in the context of this pandemic, under the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, both state and non-state actors would then have the obligation to ensure the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And this applies to both actors to ensure that healthcare systems, facilities, goods and services are available to everybody without discrimination, including migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, including persons in detention. Now, in the context of a pandemic, the maximum of their available resources should be directed to COVID-19. And that is including for prevention, screening and treatment measures. So Libyan actors, to do that, must do essentially three things. They have to reprioritise existing resources. They have to expand them. And particularly given the scarcity of resources in Libya, they have to seek, or they should seek, international cooperation and assistance to boost them. Now, on this latter point, the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has made it very clear that states have to coordinate with each other in the allocation of responsibilities. So not just Libya, but other states have to coordinate with Libya and all Libyan actors to provide humanitarian assistance in times of emergency, contributing to the maximum of their capacities. What does this mean in Libya in the context of the pandemic, in the context of the conflict that's escalated over the last months? Well, this means that all parties to the conflict in Libya and their foreign backers should prioritise the health and life of the population over their political ambitions by ceasing to engage in the conflict or supporting the continuation of it. They should coordinate to redirect the resources that are currently being put into the conflict to addressing the health crisis. It also means that the multiple state and non-state actors operating across Libya at the moment, and there are quite a few that are being tasked to tackle the crisis, should coordinate their actions to ensure that the medical supplies and services are directed where they are most needed, irrespective of whether or not such needs fall within territory under the effective control.
Great. Can we circle back to that as the discussions take place, Kate? Thank you very much for that very detailed look at how and what not only the obligations of the state are, or what the state then should be, what steps should the state be taking in order to meet these obligations. And next, very briefly, I think you touched on, Kate, on the refugee and migrant situation as well, in terms of those that are currently being held in prolonged arbitrary detention, as we know, for those, particularly those who are intercepted at sea and then brought back to Libya and then handed over to the detention centers. Again, with there's no judicial oversight in terms of these centers, and so we have been calling for I mean, historically, for the release of the the refugees and migrants from detention. And now even more so, it has become even more pressing. We already know that the context and the situation for refugees and migrants inside of these detention centers are dire in terms of the sanitation and access to services within these centers. And so it's become, in light of the pandemic, even more pressing that these centers, which are fertile ground for the spread of diseases, are even more need and pressing to have everyone released from these centers and provide equal access to health in light of the current pandemic as well. And so those obligations that you mentioned, Kate, in terms of the responsibility of the state and non-state actors fall on within the context of the refugee and migrant detention as well. And we're happy to circle back on that later as well. But I'd like to now move on to Asma, who submitted a piece on the situation of women in Libya. And I think what was particularly striking about your piece, Asma, is how it highlights the policies and policymakers have largely, historically and particularly today, overlooked the inclusion of or overlooked half of the population, as your piece mentions in its title. While this has been an ongoing struggle, we know the pandemic has kind of brought this back into the center stage of the discussions of how women are largely affected by the conflict, and now more so by the pandemic. And so in your piece, you point out how women have been neglected, their voices not reflected in the decision-making process. Their voices are absent in the decision-making process itself, and are not actively brought in to that. What was most interesting, however, is how this has how this pandemic has kind of highlighted again the long-lasting impact on different areas. For example, you mentioned women working in the hospitals and the stigmas related to that when in light of the pandemic and working in the front lines of the virus. How the lockdown has been particularly detrimental on women, and now facing a triple threat of conflict, virus, and domestic violence. So if you could, Asma, take this as an opportunity to kind of talk us through how the conflict has affected women in general, and more so now with the pandemic, how women are being disproportionately impacted by the situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Marwa, and thanks for Libyan Lawyers for Justice in Libya and Open Democracy for having me today. I think how I would lay it out is that in any setting where there's already inequality, whatever happens or occurs, that of course has a negative impact, impacts portion of society more than the other. And the war in Libya is quite gendered. Women don't fight. They don't have, they don't belong in armed groups. While some could enjoy potentially protection from family members who are in armed groups, they themselves don't fight. They're not represented in the decision making. They're not in the presidential council. Even those who hold ministerial positions do not take assertive measures because they fear the repercussions that could be life-threatening, as there's been several cases from 2014 onwards. So in civil society, where a lot of women are active, because on a national level that's not possible, their direct involvement with the communities in need and in providing services and in responding to issues that happen has never made it to the decision-making table, because there is no communication channels, even though there is a women empowerment unit, which functions in a very strange way in isolation of all that is happening. their communication with civil society is limited to those, again, to those people they know and people they work with. So when the pandemic happened, we immediately thought about women who run small businesses, and there's quite a lot of them because there's been quite a lot of funding going on with women female entrepreneurs and female incubations around the country. And then we understand that Libyan society as a whole has a very stubborn way of consistently trying to treat women in the same traditional framework that it has for centuries before. Even though the war has changed everything, women are still expected to be protected and treated, and that the man would provide. Therefore, women who work and women who are sole providers, widows, women who lost all men in this conflict and therefore have had bigger responsibilities, are not really, are not ever in the picture, because they treat them as an exception, or as their case doesn't happen, or that her uncle should take care of her now, and that her husband is not around. Or so these women who have who work on a daily basis, women who work in pink collar jobs, so women who work in cleaning services or jobs that require a daily presence in the workplace, are extremely vulnerable, because the lockdown at the beginning was quite severe. It was from 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. There's hardly any work that could be done during that time. Public transportation did not work for quite a while, so those who don't have cars can't move, basically. And then adding to that, women would not be able to, for instance, walk for quite a distance of time to go to their jobs. If they live in certain areas, they can't just take the public bus, if there is a bus, or even taxis sometimes are not an option. So women a lot rely on these drivers that it's like a carpool that they do to pick them up with other workers, and with the restrictions of movement, that is not working anymore. So the impact is quite severe. I've seen at least several internally displaced women who were living up in their cars in Tripoli around Gilgamesh Road, because they weren't able to pay rent, and so they were kicked out. So internally displaced are not always families, of course. An extremely vulnerable group that over 4 days ago were bombed in one of their locations. So they're not even safe when they leave conflict areas or targeted areas. Power cuts have been quite long, and water cuts have been quite long. So women who work in the health sector have complained quite heavily about this, and about being afraid to go to work because they might jeopardize their entire families of being infected. And of course, you have all these budgets that were thrown around on the pandemic. For instance, there was all municipalities were given a certain amount of money, but the CDC was actually only given 2 million Libyan dinars. So it was quite disproportionate, this budget thing, and very random. And despite that, there was the response from women who run sewing workshops or sewing factories, and women who run organizations that could do this work have been providing the health services with protection masks and gears for hospitals. But that's why I wrote the last part of the piece. Is my worry is that, again, we respond, we work, we try to find solutions, even if they are temporary to the crisis, however it comes up. But that's never going to make it anywhere. That we will continue to be sidelined, because basically we don't run around with our Kalashnikovs, and that's going to be extremely it will be extremely negative on the whole Libya overall.
Great, thank you very much, Asma, for painting that very clear picture of how women are impacted most definitely, disproportionately in the context of Libya by conflict and what the realities of that is today. how the conflict over the years have impacted, and now with the pandemic. So thank you very much for all the panelists. We should now move on to questions and give an opportunity to our audience to present questions. First, I would like to take the questions that were submitted prior at registration. We've had a few questions that maybe this would be a good opportunity to address. And then we have some questions from already submitted from our audience that we can move to next. And if anyone does want to submit a question, you can send them in our question and answer boxes. It would be very helpful if you can identify which panelists you're addressing your question to as well. So I think we'll start with one of the questions that were pre-sent, which is, and perhaps Tarek or Hanan, you may want to take this question on, which is, what role, if any, can the UK government play in mitigating against the conditions that are currently faced by the Libyan people? And I'll open the floor to our panelists to address that. Tarek?
Sure, I'll take it on. Did you say the UK government, or? Well, you know, it's quite a wide-ranging question in terms of what can any one government do to alleviate the full range of problems that the Libyan people are suffering from right now. But I think that the United Kingdom specifically can play a very powerful role on the diplomatic stage in trying to address some of the bigger overarching issues that hang over Libya right now, such as the ongoing war, and then even to help facilitate deliveries of corona-related equipment, PPEs, and so on, to the Libyan population afterwards. Because something which has come up in what some people have been saying is that the Center for Disease Control there have struggled to kind of procure equipment on the global stage whilst everybody else is trying to do so. And I think last but not least, something which is quite important and which was picked up on by some of the other panelists is the degree of problems in kind of command and control on a governance standpoint, if you will. So, you have loads of municipalities in place who perhaps don't have the right empowerment or resources to do their jobs. And you have a central government which is creaking under the strain of so many disparate problems and inefficiencies that it's unable to properly support those municipalities to carry out the job on the ground. So, just to step back for a minute, there's the obvious role on the diplomatic stage. There's helping the Libyan people to deal with that immediate threat of coronavirus. And then there's the capacity building issue that, improving governance on a local level, on a national level, and perhaps most crucially, the interlinkage between the two.
If I may add to that, thank you so much, Tarek. From my point of view, I think there's one very concrete issue that the UK could do. I mentioned the Human Rights Council and the session in June where a resolution is already tabled. Traditionally, the United Kingdom has been strong on accountability. They have been the penholder even on many of these resolutions. The United Kingdom, due to the own, all the issues around Brexit and all the issues, the political issues that took center stage, took a back seat really now when it comes to accountability in Libya. And I think that can change. I mean, I think that there's a lot of room to ramp up the rhetoric a little bit and to support and push for more accountability and more robust accountability measures, and specifically to really rally the troops when it comes to the Human Rights Council in June, and when it comes to passing a resolution that will create not a little inquiry that will, a meaningless, I don't want to say meaningless, but a little inquiry that will have, little clout, but to really create a robust mechanism for an international investigation. I think there the UK can have a strong role, given that traditionally it has worked on this issue, and the UK delegation there in Geneva, they know exactly how to do this.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So the next question that we have is, and perhaps Hanan or Kate, you may want to address this. And I think, Kate, you touched on this a bit, is what role do state actors on all sides, can they play in terms of preventing the pandemic or hindering its, what are the concrete steps that the state should be taking in order to address the potential of an outbreak inside of Libya? And their legal obligations, I would say. Hanan, do you want to start with that in terms of?
Sure, I'm happy to take a stab at it. I think that, you know, Kate laid out really well in terms of the different actors in Libya. I don't want to start a debate here on who's a state actor. You know, there's other versions of that. And I think, you know, I may agree or may not agree that who is a state actor, who's a non-state actor, but let's just say that all those actors currently involved in the conflict in Libya rise to the level of a state actor or a state-like actor, meaning that they have equal responsibilities when it comes to international humanitarian law and when it comes to respecting international humanitarian law. And, you know, no one is absolved of that. That's one thing. It is illegal and prohibited to target a health facility during a war. That's, you know, regardless of whether there's a pandemic or not, that is absolutely illegal. And that has been happening across the board in Libya. We have seen that hospitals have been targeted. We have seen that field clinics have been targeted, and specifically health workers have been targeted and killed, including ambulance drivers and others who have been marked and clearly marked as health workers. And that is clearly a violation of the laws of war. In the situation of a pandemic, you are in need of a robust health system or a health structure to respond to that. So the state must respond in a way that you allocate the sufficient resources. Kate touched on that, you know, the state has a responsibility to do that, to have a plan in place. I think that, you know, the government of national accord and the other government, the interim government, you know, on the eastern side, have provided some information on how they plan to respond to this pandemic. But I do not believe that it was sufficient. I believe that it included some elements in terms of imposing a curfew, for example, or specifying that the CDC will be responsible for tracking the cases and dealing with the corona cases. But I do not see that there has been a specific or detailed plan on how all the different sectors and all the different services are to be provided should there be a much bigger outbreak. If you are unable to use your hospitals because they're being shelled, you need to find another possibility of where you're going to treat people. Do you have sufficient testing in place? Do you have testing in the right places? Are you sure that the vulnerable communities, particularly the internally displaced people, and there, I think, you know, Asma touched on the issue of the gendered aspect of this war, how women also are. There's also single women households that are currently internally displaced with children that are alone living in these shelters that have no male relatives or others really to take care of them. And there you have to take all of these issues into consideration. Are you reaching these communities? Are you testing in Libyan prisons? There's thousands of people held in arbitrary detention. And that's not migrants and asylum seekers. That's Libyans that are held in long-term arbitrary detention without judicial review. Do you have a plan in place if there is an outbreak in one of their prisons? Any country would struggle with that. A country like Libya, with a very violent and very degraded prison system, really, that is completely overcrowded and that has no, sufficient measures in place. How are authorities going to plan with it? So I have not seen anything details to that extent. Releasing some detainees, which we had called for and others have called for, has happened to a small extent, and that's good, but you need to have a much bigger plan in place on how to reach all the vulnerable community. And there, I believe that the government of national accord cannot sit back and be like, we don't have the means, everything has been turned off, we don't have sufficient budget. That's not sufficient. That's not a sufficiently strong answer from the Presidential Council or from the government to say, sure, we need help. Sure, they need help. They need help from the international community. But there's a lot more that they can do, that they have to do in terms of planning.
Great. Thank you very much, Hanan. I think we'll move on to the next question at this point, which would be directed to Asma. And one of the questions that was presented was, does the Women, Peace and Security Agenda resolution help support or protect women human rights defenders in Libya? And if not, why? What is the reasons behind not being able to address that?
Thank you. Sadly, no. I mean, it has managed to reach certain cases to European parliaments and European governments to condemn, but because the groups operate under complete impunity and for the UN security to work on Libya, it has to manage all these states who have contradictory approach towards Libya, often quite double standards when it comes to women. I mean, they meet with us, they say that they want to support us, they could take out certain cases into their parliaments, but they continue to fund certain armed groups, they continue to even directly bomb the country. And it's basically not a priority for anyone to deal with female human rights defenders or women in general in Libya. It's never been on the agenda, regardless of how much advocacy has been done from Libyan civil society. It has also been a response that, well, everyone is suffering in Libya. Why is it women that are special in that case? And it's not sadly a case of special, but it's a case of people who are working and document or to raise awareness on human rights situations or to try to improve the conditions for the communities are not able to be protected. Their work is extremely hard. I mean, just in April, I went to a meeting at the Center for Freedom of Press, and we were attacked by a Salafist group that works in the neighborhood. There is no way that you could deal with you can continue to function in this complete impunity environment where there is absolutely no protection.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much, Asma. So moving on, I don't know if we're gonna have time to get through all the questions. We've had some great questions submitted, but I am conscious of the time that we have. But we do have a question on how much in terms, or maybe rather a statement of how the economic financial crisis in the country has made it very difficult to provide the funds and conduct basic financial transactions. And this in turn has impact on the ability of the authorities to provide the needed measures to help protect the population from this pandemic. And I think, Hanan, you touched on this and addressed that. And perhaps, and Kate, in your opening remarks, you've also laid down some very concrete measures that can be taken on regarding what steps the state should be taking in order to address this, and without the financial obligations that wouldn't cost much. But I think there's another question it says to Tarek or Kate, are there any numbers available in terms of the gender and age category of the migrants and refugees trapped in detention centers in Libya? Are there any specifics available in terms of extra vulnerabilities for women, youth in these centers? I don't know if anyone would want to kind of take that on. Hannah?
Migrant detention centers are very fluid, which means that there is a coming and going, which means that the situation changes from day to day. Currently, I don't have a statistic currently of how many people are held in what we would consider at least to be official or semi-official migrant detention centers that are run by the Directorate to Counter Illegal Migration, which is what it's called, under the Interior Ministry of both authorities, because there is one in the east and there is one in the west. Obviously, the migrant detention centers in Western Libya are the ones that are more not more problematic, but there's more of them. And Western Libya is the launch pad for where all the boats migrate to. So this is where the larger number of people are. In my experience, visiting these places, and my last visit is a little while ago, but in my experience, I would say that it's a mixed bag, but there is a very concerning, I have always come across groups of children who travel alone, meaning that they are unaccompanied children, both girls and boys, who are very much at risk of any kind of violence, particularly sexual violence and other kinds of violence. But you know, there is a very large number usually of women and children. So it is difficult to say because really on any given day, it could really be, it could look different in a given detention center.
Great, thank you, Hanan. So right before we wrap up, there is a question again for Kate with regards to non-state actors with recognized control over a territory. And I think you may have touched on the legal obligations to ensure the rights to detainees. But then in which case the question is, can this responsibility be placed? So in terms of areas where the non-state actors are present, does the state have the responsibility or does the responsibility fall entirely on non-state actors in that sense?
Yeah, there's not one real answer to that question. It really depends upon the non-state actor, their relationship with the state actor, and the extent of their territorial control. So for example, if you take a non-state actor that is has control over a detention facility, but that they're acting under the control of the state actor, then the state actor is directly responsible for any violations that occur, and directly responsible for ensuring the rights of the detainees in that centre. If, on the other hand, the non-state actor is not under the control of the state, but they exercise control over that territory, then the non-state actor would have the full range of obligations that apply under international law. So the rights to respect, protect, and fulfill, the right to health. You know, there is also in those situations, the state actor might have a due diligence obligation to take whatever reasonable measures it can to protect those people, even though it doesn't necessarily have territorial control. And the exception to that, which I don't go into in the symposium piece, is control over a detention facility, control over population, and irrespective of the territorial control, you may still have some obligations in relation to the detainee population, despite your lack of territorial control generally in the area. So yeah, it's, sorry, not one answer, but a range of answers depending on the situation, who the non-state actor is.
Great, thank you, Kate. Wow, an hour flew by. As we're wrapping up, I think it would, there's one final question that I think that would be great to just kind of close this today, which is there anything in the situation in Libya today that might be considered a reason for optimism? And I'm gonna give that one to Tarek. You started us off, and so we're gonna have you close. If there's any little bit of wisdom that you want to pass on as we wrap this up.
Thank you, Marwa. Optimism is not usually something I trade in, unfortunately, dealing with politics in Libya. But, you know, I think that there's always a case for optimism. It just depends whether those who are involved, both in Libya itself and in the international arena, would like to take the opportunities presented in front of them by the situation, or if this kind of more of passing the buck and a laissez-faire attitude will dominate and allow the current trajectory to continue, in which case Libya will keep sliding down. But I'm going to try and blend in a response to Nate Wilson's question, which I saw pop up, because this itself is a cause of optimism. I mean, if we look at some of the most recent developments that have happened, When some of the offensives of the government of national accord took place, everybody looked at the military side, but not at the fact that there were diplomatic talks ongoing between Misrata and Beni Walid, two key centers of antagonism and of conflict over the last 4 to 5 years, actually even longer. When the airbase of Watia fell on Monday, once again, everybody looked at the military aspect, not at the fact that Zintan, a town that's divided, there have been talks between these two groups for the last few weeks, which have led up to what happened. So, whilst everything is frozen on an international level, and whilst things continue to get worse because, the zero-sum game between countries is ongoing, Libyans on the ground are starting to take more initiative. And if they can be free to continue that initiative instead of being beholden to the kind of very self-serving elite that is present, then I think we all have a strong case for optimism. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Tarek. And then it's good to close on an optimistic note. So thank you very much. Thank you to all our to everyone who attended the webinar. Apologies if we weren't able to get to all the questions, but I hope that we managed to capture at least the main kind of highlights and in line with the discussions. But thank you very much to our panelists for your OPEDs and the work put into that, and for joining us today on the panel. On behalf of LFJL, we thank you. And thank you, openDemocracy, of course, for this wonderful collaboration and for hosting us on your website and here today. And with that, I say goodbye and hand over to Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marwa, and thank you very much. Without even discussing this, you asked the question that I always try and ask at the end of these, that openDemocracy or editors always try and ask at the end of these discussions, which is where's the hope, where's the opportunity, what are the potential strategies for change, and so I just wanted to encourage others to reflect on that, having listened to this conversation. We are tracking the ways that democracy, human rights are being curtailed, but also the ways that citizens are resisting and responding to COVID-19. We've got a newsletter which comes out every week, which tracks these issues across the world. It's opendemocracy.net/Corona Crackdown. And we, the final third of that newsletter every week is firmly focused on things that people, movements, organizations, politicians, doctors are doing to serve their communities and to take back power and to advance justice and equity. So I'd very much encourage anyone who's not already signed up to that to do so, because that's the question, right? It's the most fundamental question. Thank you so much to all of you for participating. I'd really encourage everyone to read the excellent series if you haven't already. I would also encourage you, if you think that these kind of conversations are important and this type of journalism is important, to consider supporting openDemocracy. You can do so at support.opendemocracy.net/donate. We run these events for free because we think they should be open and accessible to all. So any support that you can contribute is greatly welcome and helps us to continue doing what we're doing. Next week, we have a very rich discussion. The title is Out of the Belly of Hell, COVID-19 and the Human Side of Globalization. It's the discussion between Anthony Barner, openDemocracy's founder, Akila Membe, the leading post-colonial philosopher, Theo Rio-Francos, who's author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. And it's chaired by another editor-in-chief counterpart of mine, Reka Kinga-Pap, who is the Hungarian journalist and editor-in-chief of Eurozine. So do sign up for that if you haven't already. Thank you so much for participating, for all your questions and engagement. And I hope you all have excellent weeks in these challenging times. Thank you so much. Much appreciated. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.